Hello there! Today I want to share about UNC CISG, which is United Nations Convention on Contract for the International Sales of Goods 1980. Okay, next, I want to share about the definition of CISG. First is CISG is a treaty that is a uniform international sales law. The CISG attempts to bridge the gap between the legal system of trade internationally. It has been ratified by 89 states, making it one of the most successful international uniform laws. Next is the establishment of CISG. When the establishment of CISG? First is the CISG was developed by the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law and was signed in Vienna in 1980. The CISG is sometimes referred to as the Vienna Convention. Then, it came into force as a multilateral treaty on 1st January 1988 after being ratified by 11 countries. It has been described as a great legislative achievement and the most successful international document so far in unified international sales law. Next is the relevance of CISG. First is the CISG is considered one of the core international trade law conventions. The adoption of the CISG provides model uniform legislation for the international sales of goods. Then, CISG may apply to a contract for international sales of goods when the rule of private international law point at the law of the contracting state as the applicable one of by virtue of the choice of the contractual parties, regardless of whether their place of business are located in the contracting state. The importance of CISG. What is the importance of CISG? First is the CISG aims to substantially reduce barriers to international sales by creating modern substantive rules to govern the respective rights and obligations of parties to international sales contracts. The CISG is reducing uncertainty in commercial exchange and decreasing transaction costs. Thank you.
Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods have many parts. But here are the summary of the UNCCISG. The first part will be Part 1. In Part 1, it is called as Sphere of Application and General Provisions.
This part addresses the question of the applicability, as well as general matters such as interpretation and formality requirements. It is divided into two chapters. Chapter 1, Sphere of Application, encompasses Articles 1 to 6, while Chapter 2, General Provisions, covers Articles 7 to 13. Chapter 1 of Part 1 of the CISG contains provisions defining the scope of the convention. Articles 1 to 3 identify transactions to which the CISG does and does not apply. Articles 4 and 5 describe issues that are and are not addressed in the convention. Article 6 contains a broad principle of party autonomy that can affect both the transactions and the issues that are governed by the CISG.
Chapter 2 of Part 1 of the CISG contains provisions addressed to general issues under the Convention. Two of those provisions focus on interpretation. Article 7 deals with interpretation of the Convention and Article 8 speaks to interpretation of the parties' statements and conduct. Article 9 addresses the parties' legal obligations arising from usages and practices. Article 11 provides that the Convention does not require a writing or impose other formal requirements on contracts, and Article 12 states limitations on that principle. Two other provisions in Chapter 2 are terminological, focusing on issues concerning the meaning of place of business that are discussed in Article 10, and writing in Article 13. Part 2 of United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods is called Formation of the Contract. Whether there is a contract or not is the main inquiry within Part 2. These provisions relate to the offer, in Articles 14 to 17, the acceptance, in Articles 18 to 22, and the conclusion of the contract. The treatment of Article 14 states a proposal for concluding a contract constitutes an offer if it is sufficiently definite and indicates the intention of the offeror to be bound in case of acceptance. But it is to be considered merely as an invitation to make offers, unless the contrary is clearly indicated by the person making the proposal. In the Article 15 of CISG, an offer becomes effective when it reaches the offeree. Secondly, an offer, even if it is irrevocable, may be withdrawn if the withdrawal reaches the offeree before or at the same time as the offer. Second section of Part 2 is called as the acceptance. In Article 18, an acceptance of an offer becomes effective at the moment the indication of assent reaches the offerer. An acceptance is not effective if the indication of assent does not reach the offerer within the time he has fixed. However, if by virtue of the offer which have established, the offeree may indicate assent by performing an act, without notice. In Article 22, an acceptance may be withdrawn if the withdrawal reaches the offerer before or at the same time as the acceptance would have become effective. A late acceptance is nevertheless effective as an acceptance if without delay. The last section in Part 2 is the conclude of contract. A contract is concluded at the moment when an acceptance of an offer becomes effective in accordance with the provisions of convention, as well as when the offer, declaration of acceptance or any other indication reaches the address of both parties. The next part is Part 3. Part 3 of CISG is called as Sales of Goods and comprises Article 25 until Article 88. Once a contract has been established, Part 3 sets out the scope and extent of the rights and obligations of the buying process. Plus, CISG also allows the buyer the remedy of price reduction should the goods not conform to the contract. The core principle of CISG is to keep the business relationship alive. Therefore, requirements is put into place that makes avoiding a contract difficult. Fundamental breach is defined in Article 25, as a substantial deprivation of the contract. In accordance to the CISG's core principle of keeping the relationship mutually beneficial, parties have a general duty to mitigate any damages. The CISG acknowledges that in cases of force of hardship the offerer is exempt from performing his or her obligation. Subsections of Part 3 includes general provisions, obligations of seller and buyer, passing of risk and the provisions common to the obligations of the seller and of the buyer. The last part of the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods is Part 4, the final provisions. The final provisions relate to certain matters of public international law and will rarely be of interest to either party to the transaction. In summary, the CISG is an important piece of legislation promoting development and economic growth.